In December 1941, German soldiers could see Moscow's skyline, yet history turned on those last few miles. But what if the Wehrmacht had actually taken Moscow? Tonight, we'll unravel how the world's most pivotal war might have played out differently, from Stalin's fate to a reshaped global order. Do you think capturing Moscow would have broken the Soviet Union, or just delayed the inevitable? Share your answer below before we dive into the possibilities. Imagine the summer of 1941. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa with 3 massive army groups sweeping into Soviet territory. In reality, the German drive toward Moscow stalled just short of the city's limits, undone by stretched supply lines, mud, and winter. But if Hitler had concentrated even more force on Moscow earlier, ignoring southern diversions toward Ukraine, the German spearhead might have smashed through before snow arrived. Capturing Moscow would not only mean seizing the Soviet capital, but also cutting vital rail lines that held the Red Army together. Still, victory on a map does not equal strategic triumph. That's a hard truth. Even with Moscow fallen, the Soviets had vast territory east of the Urals to regroup. An industry already relocated there could keep producing tanks and planes. Here's a startling fact. Moscow was both the political heart and the logistical brain of the Soviet Union. Its rail networks fanned out like arteries, pumping troops, food, and fuel to every front. If Germany captured Moscow in 1941, they wouldn't just have planted a flag in Red Square. They would have seized the very nexus of Soviet coordination. That's a game changer. Imagine Soviet units suddenly cut off, communications collapsing, and morale shattering as their capital fell into enemy hands. Yet history teaches us a sobering paradox. Symbols inspire as much as they crumble. While losing Moscow could have devastated Soviet confidence, it might also have fueled a desperate will to resist, shifting the war into an even bloodier guerrilla conflict. Picture the scene. German troops storm into Moscow, chaos floods the streets, and Stalin faces the ultimate decision. In reality, Stalin stayed in Moscow during the crisis, projecting defiance when many expected him to evacuate. But if the capital fell, would he have stayed or fled east to Kuibyshev, the designated backup capital? Stalin's leadership was both ruthless and symbolic. His refusal to abandon Moscow kept the Soviet machine running. Had he fled, the Soviet Union might have fractured, rival leaders seizing control in different regions. That could have meant confusion, slower mobilization, and even internal collapse. Leadership under fire makes or breaks nations. One person's presence or absence can tip the balance of history. In moments of crisis, courage isn't optional, it's decisive. Moscow wasn't just a city, it was the Soviet Union's nerve center. Ministries, command posts, and the State Defense Committee all pulsed from within its walls. If German forces captured it, those institutions would be shattered overnight. Imagine frontline divisions cut off from orders, supply movements snarled, and coordination replaced by chaos. In this alternate reality, the Soviet war machine would stumble, leaving gaps for German exploitation across hundreds of miles of front lines. Yet here's the overlooked fact. By 1941, the Soviets had already started shifting backup command hubs eastward, preparing for the worst. Resilience often hides in redundancy. Morale was the lifeblood of the Red Army. Moscow's fall would have been a devastating psychological blow, not just to soldiers but to civilians across the Soviet Union. Imagine the headlines: "The proud Soviet capital under Nazi occupation." That image alone could have cracked faith in eventual victory. Yet propaganda cuts both ways. Stalin's regime mastered the art of turning disaster into defiance. Losing Moscow might have been framed as a call for vengeance, fueling bitter, relentless resistance. History proves morale can swing on symbols, but it also thrives on survival. When everything is stripped away, even ordinary people can fight harder than armies expect. Capturing Moscow is one thing. Holding it through a Russian winter is another. German armies were already starving for fuel, clothing, and spare parts as they approached the city. Occupying Moscow would stretch supply lines hundreds of miles across hostile territory, with Soviet partisans striking constantly behind the lines. A city that looks like a prize can turn into a trap. This is a timeless lesson in strategy. Overreach can destroy even the strongest force. Germany might have planted swastikas over the Kremlin, only to see their army bleed out in frozen streets. Control on a map is meaningless without sustainable logistics. That's a rule every commander and every leader ignores at their peril. Victory without supply is illusion. The Russian winter has broken armies for centuries. For Napoleon in 1812 and again for Hitler in 1941, it wasn't just the enemy but the cold that crushed ambition. Even if Germany seized Moscow, the brutal winter of 1941-42 would have turned the occupation into a nightmare. Soldiers already lacked winter clothing, vehicles froze in place, and horses, still essential for transport, died by the thousands. Imagine holding a vast city of millions while freezing to death. Occupation would demand food, fuel, and manpower Germany simply didn't have. Here's where the global chessboard shifts. With Moscow fallen, Japan might have reconsidered its strategy in 1941. Historically, Tokyo struck south against the United States and Britain, fearing a Soviet counterattack from Siberia. But if the USSR looked fatally weakened, Japan could have gambled on invading Soviet territory in the east. That would mean a two-front war the Soviets might not survive. Yet Japan's navy had already locked sights on the Pacific. Industry and resources, oil, rubber, tin, lay in Southeast Asia, not Siberia. Strategy is about priorities. Even with Moscow lost, Japan may have chosen the Pacific path, leading to Pearl Harbor all the same. Geopolitics is often swayed by perception. If Moscow had fallen in 1941, neutral states like Turkey, Spain, and Sweden would have faced immense pressure to tilt toward the Axis. Turkey, balancing between Germany and the Allies, might have seen Soviet collapse as inevitable and opened the Black Sea to German warships. That would have threatened British supply lines in the Middle East and weakened Allied influence. Spain, still recovering from civil war, could have been nudged into providing bases or resources, while Sweden might have deepened its iron ore trade with Berlin. Yet neutrality is stubborn when survival is at stake. Even with Moscow captured, leaders knew the Allied industrial might of Britain and America still loomed. A German triumph in Moscow could have emboldened Hitler to forge an even tighter Axis bloc. Imagine Berlin dictating strategy with Mussolini in Rome, Hirohito in Tokyo, and perhaps Franco in Madrid, leaning closer. A Moscow victory would have seemed like proof that the Axis was unstoppable. That illusion matters. It might have bought Germany breathing room to stabilize occupied Europe, crush partisan resistance more aggressively, and redirect resources toward Africa or the Middle East. Yet unity built on fear rarely lasts. Italy still struggled militarily, Japan still pursued its own Pacific empire, and Germany's arrogance often alienated allies. Overconfidence has toppled many coalitions. Imagine the headlines in Berlin: Moscow falls to the Reich. For ordinary Germans in 1941, such a victory would have seemed like proof that Hitler's promises were unstoppable. Morale at home, already inflated by rapid conquests, would have soared. That's dangerous. Triumphs can blind societies to looming disaster. Instead of recognizing the limits of their resources, Germans might have doubled down on belief in a 1,000-year Reich. Rationing and shortages would still gnaw at daily life, but propaganda would drown out doubt. History shows us a stark truth. When people believe they are winning, they forgive anything. Leaders can ride that wave for a while, but illusions always break against reality. Now here's the global pivot. If Germany captured Moscow, American policymakers would face an urgent dilemma. Historically, the U.S. supported the Soviets with Lend-Lease aid, betting on their survival. But with Moscow gone, Washington might have judged Soviet collapse imminent. That could have pushed Roosevelt to accelerate direct military involvement in Europe, fearing a continent fully dominated by Germany. A faster U.S. entry might have meant earlier landings in North Africa or even a rush to secure Britain's survival. And here's where you come in. If you find alternate history fascinating, subscribe now. Our next deep dives will shock you even more. Because understanding these scenarios isn't just about the past, it's about how fragile turning points shape the present. Picture Churchill in London, scanning maps with Moscow marked in black. Without the Soviet Union holding the Eastern Front, Britain would stand nearly alone against Nazi Europe. That's a chilling scenario. With no massive Soviet armies grinding down German divisions, Britain would face unrelenting pressure from the air and sea. American aid would still flow, but the timetable for U.S. troops on European soil might not match Germany's accelerated dominance. Churchill's speeches of defiance would ring even louder, but morale could erode as Britain bore the brunt alone. Here's where victory in Moscow could open unexpected doors. With the Soviet threat seemingly neutralized, Germany might have redeployed divisions south. Rommel in North Africa could have received reinforcements, threatening Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the oil-rich Middle East. Imagine the Axis controlling both European industry and Middle Eastern oil. That combination would have terrified Britain. Yet strategy is always about trade-offs. Every division sent south would be one less to hold a hostile Soviet population under occupation. Overstretch was Germany's silent killer. A captured Moscow would have emboldened Hitler beyond measure. Nazi ideology tied conquest in the East directly to racial extermination. With Moscow in German hands, the regime might have proclaimed its final proof of superiority and accelerated genocidal policies. Deportations eastward could have intensified. With millions more civilians caught in the machinery of forced labor, starvation, and execution. Victory often sharpens cruelty. And with greater control of Soviet territory, Nazi planners might have attempted to implement the horrific General Plan Ost much faster, resettling lands with Germans while erasing entire populations. But history teaches us this. Unchecked triumph doesn't create security. It breeds reckless brutality. Even with Moscow under occupation, the Soviet Union would not have gone silent. Partisan warfare, already fierce in Belarus, Ukraine, and the forests near Smolensk, would have erupted on a massive scale. Imagine German supply trains ambushed nightly, communications cut, and soldiers constantly hunted behind their own front lines. Holding Moscow would mean policing a sprawling, hostile city, while the countryside burned with sabotage. Occupation breeds resistance. History's pattern is clear. The more brutal the conqueror, the stronger the insurgency becomes. Germany may have won a city, but lost the countryside. If Germany captured Moscow in 1941, the war's timeline could have shifted dramatically. With a symbolic victory in hand, Hitler might have believed he had the breathing room to invest even more in advanced weapons, jet fighters, long-range rockets, or even the race for nuclear technology. Imagine a world where Me-262 jets dominated the skies a year earlier, or V-2 rockets rained down in greater numbers. But here's the paradox. Victories can delay urgency. Success often slows innovation because leaders feel less desperate. Meanwhile, the Allies, especially the United States, were accelerating their own breakthroughs in radar, long-range bombers, and the Manhattan Project. Even with Moscow fallen, one fact doesn't change. The United States was an industrial giant, unmatched by any Axis power. Once America committed fully to the war, tanks, planes, and ships rolled off assembly lines in numbers no one else could match. That avalanche of production was unstoppable. Germany might have enjoyed a temporary edge, but it could never outbuild America. Wars aren't won only on battlefields. They're won in factories, That's the lesson. Even with Moscow in ruins, the Allies' material superiority would eventually overwhelm Germany. It might have taken longer, it might have been bloodier, but the outcome would still bend toward Allied victory. Even with Moscow captured, Germany's fundamental flaw remained: overextension. The Wehrmacht was fighting across thousands of miles, from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea, while also occupying Western Europe and battling in North Africa. Taking Moscow wouldn't fix fuel shortages, overstretched supply lines, or the sheer manpower drain of controlling vast conquered lands. That's the hidden truth. Victory can mask weakness, but it cannot cure it. Hitler's empire would have grown bigger, but also more brittle. Here's a mind-bending possibility. If Germany had broken the Soviet Union in 1941, the post-war world might never have seen a Cold War between the US and USSR. Instead, America and Britain could have faced a dominant Nazi Europe across the Atlantic. Imagine nuclear weapons developed in a world with no Soviet counterweight, one superpower facing off against a fascist bloc. That would have transformed the entire second half of the 20th century. Yet history also shows that no empire lasts forever. A Nazi-dominated Europe would likely fracture over time. What would life have looked like for the millions of Poles, Ukrainians, and Belarusians under a German-occupied Moscow? Nazi policy gave a chilling answer. They were to be enslaved, starved, or resettled. Puppet states may have been set up as a facade, but resistance would never have ended. Occupying Moscow would not erase centuries of cultural pride or the burning will for independence. Guerrilla warfare might have lasted for generations, draining German resources and morale. And here's the lesson. Oppression creates not silence but struggle. No system built on terror survives without constant force, and constant force exhausts even empires. Had Germany captured Moscow in 1941, history would have veered into uncharted darkness. The Soviet Union might have fractured, the Allies faced a longer and bloodier road, and the map of the modern world could look unrecognizable today. Yet in the end, geography, resources, and industrial might still leaned against Germany. Their victory would have been dramatic, but unsustainable. That's the ultimate truth of this alternate scenario. Even the grandest triumphs can hide fatal cracks. Even if the Wehrmacht stormed Red Square in 1941, the war's end might not have changed as much as it first seems. The Soviet Union's vast geography, relocated industries beyond the Urals, and the unstoppable might of American production meant Germany was always fighting against impossible odds. Moscow's fall could have delayed victory, created even darker chapters, and reshaped global alliances. But in the long run, overextension and industrial imbalance still doomed the Reich. That's the sobering truth. Even the most dramatic what if can't erase fundamental weaknesses. But here's the real question for you. How different would our world look if the Nazis had bought just a few more years of dominance? Let us know your thoughts below. And don't miss our next deep dive. What if Japan had invaded Siberia instead of Pearl Harbor? That story changes everything.